Imagine this for a second. Bombs are falling, cities are burning, the world feels like it's coming apart. And millions of people are glued to their radios, not to hear explosions, but to hear a voice. Because in World War II, words didn't just describe the war, they were the war. One man used his voice to convince an entire nation that domination was destiny. The other used his words to keep a nearly defeated country from giving up when surrender would have been easier. And here's the wild part. Neither of them was just talking. Every pause, every sentence, every emotional spike was calculated. Because the right speech at the right moment could change history faster than any army. If you've ever wondered how speeches can control minds, inspire courage, or push people to do the unthinkable, you're in the right place. Because this isn't just about Churchill versus Hitler, it's about how language becomes a weapon, how psychology decides wars, and how two completely opposite voices shape the darkest years humanity has ever faced. Stick with me, because once you see how this war of words was fought, you'll never hear a powerful speech the same way again. World War II is usually told through maps, battles, and casualty numbers. But before a single tank rolled forward or a single bomb fell, the war was already being fought somewhere else, inside people's minds. This was a conflict where voices mattered as much as weapons, where the sound coming out of a radio could decide whether a nation stood firm or fell apart. In one corner of Europe, a man stepped in front of massive crowds, raising his voice until it echoed like thunder, not asking people to think, but demanding they follow, promising greatness while feeding fear and rage. That man was Adolf Hitler. In another corner, across a narrow stretch of water, stood a man with no cheering crowds, no dramatic gestures, and no easy promises, speaking instead to a frightened population huddled in homes and shelters, telling them the truth even when it hurt, telling them the road ahead would be brutal, but survivable if they refused to break. That man was Winston Churchill. This is where their real battle begins, not on the beaches, not in the skies, but in the airwaves, in speeches carefully shaped to do one thing: control how people felt about the future. Hitler's voice was designed to overwhelm, to make individuals feel small, and replace their identity with something larger and more dangerous, something that demanded loyalty without question. Churchill's voice did the opposite. It reminded people they were tired, scared, and hurting, but also reminded them that those feelings meant they were still human, still capable of choosing resistance over surrender. One voice pushed people forward by inflaming emotion and silencing doubt. The other pulled people together by acknowledging fear and transforming it into resolve. What makes this so powerful is that both men understood something timeless. Wars aren't won only by soldiers, they're won by belief. Belief that victory is inevitable, or belief that survival is worth the cost. Every word they spoke was a weapon, every pause a strategy, every sentence aimed at shaping reality itself. And as this war dragged on through its darkest years, these two voices would clash again and again, one trying to bend the world to his will, the other trying to keep a world from collapsing entirely. This isn't just a story about speeches, it's about how language can save a nation or destroy one. To really get why this war of words mattered so much, you've got to put yourself in that time period for a second. Because this wasn't the world we live in today, where you can pause a video, fact check in 10 seconds, and scroll past something you don't like. Back then, information traveled slower, and when it arrived, it hit harder, because it usually came from just a few places: newspapers, posters, and most importantly, the radio. And the radio wasn't just background noise like it is now. It was the living room stage where history spoke directly into your home. Families would gather around it the way we gather around our phones today. And whatever came through that speaker didn't feel like content. It felt like reality itself. If you were living in London during the Blitz, or in Berlin during the rise of Nazi power, you weren't just listening for updates. You were listening for direction, for reassurance, for someone to tell you what all this fear meant and what you were supposed to do with it. In a war where people could lose everything overnight, the voice that sounded confident, clear, and certain could literally keep a population from panicking, breaking, or giving up. And that's the part most people miss. World War II wasn't just a fight between armies. It was a fight to control morale, the invisible fuel that keeps a country moving when everything is falling apart. Morale is what decides whether workers keep showing up to factories after air raids, whether soldiers keep fighting after losing friends, whether civilians keep believing the struggle is worth it when food is scarce and the nights feel endless. If you can crush a nation's morale, you don't always need to invade it the traditional way, because people start collapsing from the inside. That's why leaders treated speeches like weapons. A great speech could steady a shaking country. A dangerous speech could turn fear into hatred, and hatred into obedience. And because so many people relied on the same channels for information, one strong message could spread everywhere, fast and sink deep. Now add one more thing. This was the age of mass crowds and mass messaging. Big rallies weren't just events. They were designed to make people feel like they were part of something unstoppable. When thousands of voices chant the same words and raise their arms in the same motion, it doesn't just look powerful, it feels powerful, and that feeling can drown out doubt. On the other side, you had a very different scene. People alone in their homes, listening to a radio in the dark, hoping the roof holds through the night, hoping tomorrow still exists. In both cases, words weren't decoration. They were guidance. They were emotional steering wheels. They told people who to trust, who to fear, what to hope for, and what to sacrifice. And the reason Churchill and Hitler become such a perfect comparison is because they understood this at the highest level. Each one crafted language to shape the public's mind during the war's darkest years, but they aimed it in completely opposite directions. One used words to tighten control and demand submission. The other used words to build resilience and keep people standing when everything inside them wanted to fall. Now that you understand why words mattered so much during World War II, it's time to meet the two men who understood that power better than anyone else. Because even though they were fighting the same war, they were fighting it for completely different reasons, with completely different missions in mind. On one side, you have Winston Churchill, a man who didn't even become prime minister until the war was already turning into a nightmare. Britain was isolated, allies were falling, cities were being bombed, and many people quietly believed defeat was only a matter of time. Churchill wasn't chosen because he was charming or universally liked. He was chosen because he understood reality, and more importantly, he wasn't afraid to speak it out loud. His mission wasn't to promise glory or quick victory. His mission was survival. He needed to keep an exhausted, frightened population mentally standing when everything around them screamed collapse. Every speech he gave had one central goal: convince ordinary people that enduring pain today was the only path to having a tomorrow at all. On the other side stood Adolf Hitler, a man whose entire rise to power was built on his voice long before the war ever began. Hitler didn't stumble into leadership during a crisis. He created momentum through speech, through rallies that felt less like political events and more like emotional explosions. His mission was expansion and domination, and his words were designed to remove doubt, silence questions, and replace individual thinking with blind loyalty. Where Churchill spoke to people as individuals sharing a burden, Hitler spoke to crowds as a single body, a single will, a single force meant to move in one direction. He didn't want people to wrestle with fear. He wanted them to feel powerful, superior, and chosen, even as they were being pushed toward violence and destruction. What makes this clash so fascinating is that both men understood the same basic truth. People don't fight just because they're ordered to. They fight because they believe in something. But what they wanted people to believe couldn't have been more different. Churchill wanted belief in endurance, in shared sacrifice, in holding the line even when victory felt distant and uncertain. Hitler wanted belief in destiny, in enemies that had to be crushed, in the idea that obedience itself was virtue. One leader used words to anchor people to reality, even when that reality was grim. The other used words to bend reality, turning fear and frustration into fuel for conquest. And as the war deepened and the cost grew higher, these two missions would collide not just on the battlefield, but in every sentence spoken to millions of listeners hanging on every word, hoping those words could tell them who they were in what they were becoming. To understand how Adolf Hitler used words as a weapon, you have to stop thinking of his speeches as normal political talks and start seeing them as performances designed to overpower the listener. Hitler didn't speak to explain ideas or invite debate. He spoke to command emotion. His speeches followed a very deliberate pattern. He would begin slowly, almost quietly, letting tension build, then gradually raise his voice, sharpen his words, and push the crowd into a shared emotional state where thinking took a back seat and feeling took over. Anger, fear, pride, and humiliation were all pulled to the surface, stirred together, and aimed at a single target. He constantly framed Germany as a victim that had been betrayed and humiliated. And once that sense of injury was locked in, he offered an outlet, someone to blame, someone to hate, someone responsible for all the pain people were feeling. This wasn't accidental. Historians and psychologists have pointed out that repetition was one of his most powerful tools. The same phrases, the same enemies, the same promises were repeated again and again until they stopped sounding like opinions and started sounding like undeniable facts. What made this strategy especially dangerous was how it stripped people of individuality. Hitler rarely spoke to people as individuals with personal struggles. He spoke to them as part of a collective, a mass that moved and felt as one. Massive rallies weren't just about showing support, they were psychological machines. When you're surrounded by thousands of people chanting the same words, raising their arms in the same motion, reacting at the same moment, it creates the illusion that everyone agrees, that doubt doesn't exist, and that resistance is pointless. Fear played a huge role here too. Hitler constantly warned of looming threats and enemies, creating a world where people felt under siege even when they weren't. And in a world filled with fear, obedience starts to feel like safety. The message was simple but terrifyingly effective. Trust the leader, follow orders, and everything will be taken care of. Questioning wasn't just discouraged, it was portrayed as betrayal. Over time, this kind of rhetoric reshaped how people saw themselves and the world around them. Personal responsibility faded, replaced by loyalty to the movement. Moral lines blurred because once a leader convinces you that your enemies are monsters and your cause is destiny, almost anything can be justified. Hitler's words didn't just motivate, they removed hesitation. They trained people to obey first and think later, if at all. And while this approach could generate explosive energy and short-term unity, it came with a hidden cost. It depended entirely on momentum, on victory, on the leader always appearing strong and unstoppable. The moment reality began to contradict the promises, when defeats piled up and suffering increased, the same rhetoric that once energized millions had nowhere to go but further into denial, rage, and desperation. That's the dark genius of Hitler's strategy. It could seize control of a nation's emotions, but it could never teach them how to endure the truth. Now here's where the contrast gets almost shocking, because if Hitler's speeches were built to overwhelm people and force them into obedience, Winston Churchill did something that sounds simple but was actually incredibly brave for a leader in wartime. He told people the truth, even when the truth was ugly, and he did it in a way that made them feel stronger instead of hopeless. Churchill wasn't trying to hypnotize anyone with promises of easy victory. He wasn't selling comfort. He was building resolve. And he knew you can't build real resolve on fantasies because fantasies collapse the moment reality hits. So he spoke like a man standing in the same storm as everyone else, not like someone watching from a safe distance. Instead of pretending the danger wasn't real, he named it. Instead of telling people to relax, he told them, in plain language, that the road ahead would be hard, and then he gave them something even more powerful than reassurance, a reason to keep going anyway. Churchill's style worked because it created trust. Think about it. When someone tells you everything is fine, while you can literally hear the air raid sirens outside, you don't feel comforted. You feel lied to. Churchill understood that. So he did the opposite. He would acknowledge fear and sacrifice up front, almost like he was saying, yes, you're exhausted. Yes, you're scared. Yes, this is going to hurt. And then he'd pivot to meaning, but this matters. This is worth it. And if we endure, we win. That's the key difference. He didn't try to erase people's fear. He transformed it into determination. He spoke to ordinary people as if they were partners in the fight, not tools. The message wasn't obey me. The message was stand with me. That shift alone changes everything because people will endure far more when they feel respected, included, and trusted with the truth. And here's another thing Churchill did brilliantly. He made resistance feel simple and clear. Not easy, but clear. He used strong, direct language and memorable phrases that people could hold on to when times got dark. He understood that in a crisis, the human mind doesn't want complicated explanations. It wants something it can repeat, something it can cling to. So he spoke with rhythm, short, sharp sentences mixed with longer, rolling lines that sounded almost like marching footsteps. This is where you can mention a fact in your script without turning it into a history lecture. Churchill was famous for carefully crafting his speeches, revising and polishing them so they hit with maximum force because he knew the sound and structure of a sentence could help it land emotionally and stick in memory. And he wasn't delivering those words to cheering stadiums. Often he was speaking to people listening quietly in their homes, in shelters, in blackout conditions, trying to hold themselves together. His job wasn't to spark a frenzy, it was to keep a nation from breaking. What makes Churchill's rhetoric so effective is that it didn't depend on constant victory. It was built for endurance. He didn't say, we're winning, so follow me. He said, this is going to be brutal, but we can take it, and we must. That's why his words didn't collapse when the war got worse. They were designed for the worst days. His speeches were like psychological armor, not pretending the blows wouldn't come, but helping people absorb them without falling apart. And the result was massive, because when you're fighting a war, weapons matter, strategy matters, numbers matter, but none of it works if your people lose the will to continue. Churchill's greatest rhetorical weapon wasn't fear or rage. It was something steadier and rarer. The ability to look straight at darkness, refuse to flinch, and convince millions of ordinary people that they could refuse too. When you strip it all down, this is where the war of words becomes a psychological battlefield. Because Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill weren't just giving speeches. They were shaping how millions of people felt. And those feelings decided how people behaved when everything was on the line. Hitler's psychological strategy was built around fear and certainty. He created a world where danger felt constant and overwhelming, where enemies were everywhere and survival depended on absolute unity behind one leader. Fear was the engine. If people were scared enough, scared of outsiders, scared of chaos, scared of losing their place, then obedience started to feel like protection. The more afraid people became, the more they clung to simple answers and strong authority. This is a well-documented psychological pattern. When fear spikes, critical thinking drops. Hitler didn't need people to analyze his words. He needed them to feel them, to react instantly and emotionally. His speeches were designed to flood the mind, leaving no space for doubt, reflection, or resistance. Churchill's approach couldn't have been more different, and honestly, it was far riskier. Instead of trying to control fear, he acknowledged it. Instead of pretending people weren't terrified, he spoke directly to that fear and then challenged it. This is what made his rhetoric so powerful psychologically. He treated fear as something that could be faced, not something that had to be buried or redirected into hate. When people heard Churchill speak, they weren't being told, you are safe. They were being told, you are not safe, but you are not powerless either. That distinction matters because it gives people agency. Psychologically, defiance works when people believe their actions still matter, even in terrible conditions. Churchill reinforced that belief over and over, reminding people that endurance itself was a form of resistance, that simply refusing to break was already a kind of victory. And here's the deeper difference that often gets overlooked. Hitler's rhetoric pushed responsibility away from the individual, while Churchill's pulled responsibility toward them. Under Hitler's words, people were encouraged to dissolve into the movement, to stop questioning, to let the leader carry the burden of decision-making. Under Churchill's words, people were asked to shoulder the burden together, to keep going, to do their part, to accept hardship with eyes open. Fear narrows the mind, defiance steadies it. Fear makes people reactive. Defiance makes them resilient. One approach creates explosive energy that burns fast and demands constant success. The other creates slower, quieter strength that can survive setbacks, loss, and long nights when victory feels impossibly far away. That's why this psychological battle mattered so much. When reality turned brutal, and it always does in war, fear-based control started cracking under its own weight. Promises stopped matching outcomes. Certainty turned into denial. Rage had nowhere left to go. Meanwhile, defiance-based resilience held, because it had been built for suffering from the start. Churchill didn't promise people they wouldn't fall. He convinced them they could get back up. And in a war where morale could collapse faster than cities, that psychological difference wasn't just important, it was decisive. Eventually, every speech, no matter how powerful, has to face the one thing it can't control: reality. This is the moment when words stop being theory and start being tested by bombs, hunger, loss, and exhaustion. And this is where the difference between these two voices becomes impossible to ignore. When the war turned brutal, and it did, faster and harder than anyone expected, Adolf Hitler doubled down on the same promises that had fueled his rise. Victory was always just around the corner. Enemies were always on the verge of collapse. Any setback wasn't a failure of strategy, but the result of betrayal, weakness, or hidden enemies within. The problem was simple: reality didn't cooperate. As defeats mounted and suffering increased, his rhetoric became more detached, more extreme, and more desperate. Instead of helping people understand what was happening, his words tried to overwrite what they could see with their own eyes. And when language starts denying reality instead of explaining it, trust begins to crack. You can only tell people they're winning for so long while they're burying loved ones, rationing food, and watching cities turn to rubble. The same speeches that once electrified crowds now demanded belief without evidence, loyalty without results. And psychologically, that's where fear-based rhetoric starts eating itself alive. When promises fail, leaders have to raise the volume, sharpen the threats, and push harder for obedience, because the words alone can no longer carry the illusion. Instead of steadying people, the speeches became pressure, forcing reality to fit the narrative instead of preparing people to face the truth. Momentum mattered too much. Victory had to keep coming, and when it didn't, the language had nowhere left to go but denial and blame. On the other side of the war, Winston Churchill was facing the same brutal reality, but his words had been built for this exact moment. When Britain was bombed night after night, when invasion felt possible, when losses piled up, his speeches didn't collapse because they had never promised comfort or certainty in the first place. He had already told people it would be hard. He had already warned them it would be costly. So when the worst arrived, his words didn't feel like lies. They felt like confirmation. That consistency mattered more than optimism ever could. People didn't feel tricked. They felt prepared. And preparation is what allows morale to survive even when conditions are terrible. What's powerful here is that Churchill's rhetoric didn't depend on winning every battle. It depended on not giving up. Losses didn't invalidate his message. They reinforced it. Every hardship became proof that endurance was necessary, that resistance was meaningful precisely because it was difficult. His speeches became emotional anchors, something people could return to when everything else felt unstable. While one leader's words tried to escape reality, the others helped people stand inside it without collapsing. And that's the moment where the war of words truly reveals its outcome. Not when the speeches are loudest, but when reality is harshest. Because in the end, the words that survive are the ones that don't pretend the storm isn't there, but teach people how to stay standing while it passes. When the guns finally went quiet and the world began trying to understand what had just happened, something interesting became clear almost immediately. The war ended, but the words didn't. Long after cities were rebuilt and borders redrawn, the voices of Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler continued to echo, but in very different ways and for very different reasons. Churchill's speeches didn't fade into history books as dusty artifacts. They stayed alive. They were quoted, replayed and studied not because they were perfect pieces of writing, but because they captured something timeless about human endurance. Even people who know nothing about World War II can recognize the power of his words because they speak to moments we all face at some point: fear, uncertainty, and the need to keep going when giving up feels easier. His language outlived the war because it wasn't tied to a single victory or moment. It was tied to a mindset. Hitler's words, on the other hand, survived in a completely different way. They didn't endure as inspiration, they endured as warnings. Today, his speeches are studied carefully, not to admire them, but to understand how language can be used to manipulate, dehumanize, and control. Historians, educators, and psychologists analyze his rhetoric to show how fear, repetition, and emotional pressure can override critical thinking and push ordinary people toward extraordinary cruelty. That alone is a powerful lesson. Words don't disappear just because the speaker loses. They leave a trail. And depending on how they're used, that trail can either guide people forward or serve as a caution sign for generations to come. What really separates these two legacies is how they relate to truth. Churchill's words aged well because they were rooted in reality. He didn't promise perfection, he promised effort. He didn't deny suffering, he gave it meaning. So when future generations look back, his speeches still feel honest, still feel relevant, still feel human. Hitler's words, by contrast, collapsed under the weight of their own lies. They required constant distortion, constant enemies, constant victories that never truly arrived. Once the illusion broke, the language couldn't stand on its own anymore. It became evidence, not of strength, but of how easily words can be twisted into tools of destruction. And that's the real legacy of this war of words. One voice reminds us how language can steady people in chaos, how it can turn fear into resolve without erasing reality. The other reminds us how language can erase empathy, silence doubt, and convince people that obedience is the same thing as righteousness. Both legacies matter because they show us that words don't just describe history, they shape how history happens and how it's remembered. Long after the battle's end, the words that survive are the ones that either help humanity understand itself or force it to confront its darkest mistakes. When you step back and look at the entire war through this lens, one uncomfortable truth starts to stand out. The most dangerous weapon in World War II wasn't always the tank, the bomber, or the battlefield. It was the voice that told people how to think, what to fear, and what was worth sacrificing everything for. Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler both understood that deeply, and that's why their words mattered as much as their armies. One used language to steady people when the world felt like it was collapsing, to tell them the truth and trust them with it, even when that truth was painful. The other used language to overwhelm, to simplify reality into enemies and slogans, to replace thinking with obedience and doubt with certainty. And the consequences of those choices didn't just shape the war, they shaped millions of lives long after the last shot was fired. What makes this so relevant, and honestly so unsettling, is that none of this is ancient history locked away in black and white footage. The same psychological mechanics are still with us. Fear still narrows thinking. Repetition still turns ideas into truth. Honesty still builds trust, and manipulation still erodes it, even if it works for a while. The difference is that today, voices travel faster and farther than ever before. That makes understanding this war of words more important now than it's ever been, because once you see how language was used to inspire courage or justify destruction, you start hearing modern speeches differently. You start listening not just to what's being said, but how it's being said and why. And maybe that's the final lesson here. Words don't just motivate people in moments of crisis. They reveal the kind of future a leader is trying to build. Churchill's words asked people to endure together, to face reality without flinching, and to hold on to their humanity even in the darkest hours. Hitler's words asked people to surrender their judgment, their empathy, and eventually their responsibility. Both voices were powerful. Both moved millions, but only one left behind something that could survive the truth. Because in the end, the most dangerous weapon isn't a loud voice or a passionate speech. It's language that stops people from thinking for themselves. And the most powerful defense against that weapon is learning to recognize it before it ever takes hold. Before you click away, just take a second to sit with this idea, because this story isn't really asking you to remember dates or speeches. It's asking you to notice something. The next time you hear a powerful voice, whether it's coming from a screen, a stage, or a headline, don't rush to decide if you agree or disagree. Instead, listen a little closer. Ask yourself what that voice is doing to your emotions. Is it calming fear or amplifying it? Is it encouraging you to think or pushing you to stop thinking and simply follow? Those questions matter more than they seem, because history shows us that words don't need permission to shape the world. They just need an audience that isn't paying attention. If this video made you see speeches in a new way, share it with someone who loves history, psychology, or just understanding how power really works behind the scenes. And if you want more stories like this, where we break down big moments in history and explain them in a way that actually makes sense, stick around. Because the more you understand how words have been used in the past, the harder it becomes for them to quietly control the future.